Welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. I'm Paul John Dykes, and tonight I'm delighted to be joined by David Lowe. So, David Lowe, welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. I think you're due a testimonial. You've been on about 6 times now.
Yeah, not recently, but yeah.
Exactly, and every time we meet, there are subjects to cover. There are new subjects to cover. But we're sitting here in Barra's Art and Design in the heart of the Barralands. It's from Barrafield to the Barras. There's a record in front of us. And I've always found it interesting that you've got this love of football, but you've also got a love of music as well. Could you take us back to your involvement in having a recording studio as well?
Well, yeah, I've always been interested in music because we all grew up with music. 1960s for people my age, but particularly the 1970s. And all our record collections, or her father's record collections, always had these cheesy old Celtic CDs, not CDs, sorry, LPs. It was a mixture of Glenn Daly singing old folk songs and sundry Irish rebel tunes, side 1, side 2. So that's part of a makeup, but it was a fantastic time for music. You know, it was the war was leaving us all behind. Harold Macmillan saying, "You've never had it so good." Everybody was growing their hair, everybody was into music, and it just must have soaked into my DNA because I just love music. Love songs, artists, and from then on till today. So we just grew up with music. And when I came back to Glasgow in the early 90s, I think it was, I said, I'm just going to get involved in music and football, things that I like. Don't want to do anything else. I want everything nice and neat. I want a kid's school, my office, and my house all within a 1 mile radius. And I'll just do music and football and have a great time because I've got enough money. And that was it. So me, a couple of mates, Mark Wilson was the manager of Bluebells, Trash Can Sinatras at the time. A couple of other guys who unfortunately have passed on, so to speak, opened up a studio called St. Clair in Osborne Street, just up at the cross there. And it was a halcyon time for Glasgow bands. There was over 40 Scottish bands, largely West of Scotland bands with record deals, ranging from Simple Minds at the top of the tree down to lots of wannabes. All the record companies were all up here, just signing Glasgow bands right, left and centre. And you had Delamitri, you had Deacon Blue, you had Texas had deals at this point. Annie Lennox was in the studio. Everybody who was anybody was in at some point. It was a great time when we were all young and doing bad things and having a brilliant time. So that was my connection with music, which has sort of been maintained to this day. So it's a great love of mine. And again, another thing that's good about Scottish music or Glasgow music is just about everybody's a Celtic fan. There's very few, very, very few Rangers fans. I can't think of any. Wait, Amy McDonald thinks her name, that's about it. But we've got all the cool guys. You would say Mines, Texas.
Absolutely. Howlin' at Tina Lewis, Capaldi. You mentioned JJ Gilmer as well. JJ Gilmer, for me, is a sensational singer. What a voice. And we spoke a while back with JJ and Gary John about a Celtic song that they had recorded in your studio as well. Can you remember them coming in and doing that?
Very vaguely. I mean, there is a connection. It's a long time ago, but I remember when we had this studio, I think it was the Celtic board at the time, it was pre the revolution and all that, said we want to do a Celtic record. There hadn't been any for like 20 years, all the old Glenn Daly stuff. And because Hugh and Cry were in the studio a lot, and because I was friendly with Gary John's younger, I remember. But I knew him as well. We got, and I think Jinky would have been in the Silencers at the time. I think he was still in them at the time. And they were a cool band. And a friend of mine was a drummer, Martin Hanlon, was the original drummer. I think he put the band together with Jimmy and Neil. Anyway, I asked Jinky or JJ, hey, Celtic want a record, do you want to have a go at it? And I think he got Gary John involved.
Right.
And they produced this record, But the Celtic board really didn't take it all that seriously. And the demo I still have, I don't know where it is, but it's in the house somewhere. I think Greg did one as well, Greg Kane.
Right.
Because they were a big deal at the time. And Greg did a demo, walking up London Road, all that crap.
I need to hear this, Stuart. I need to hear it because You know, things that are hidden in an archive gathering dust.
Yeah.
Well, we resurrected The Glory and a Dream, and the Wakes re-recorded it, and we raised a few quid for charity, and it was great. But I got to know Gary, John and JJ through that. And then it branches off and you realise actually the studio was David Lowe's, and everything starts to join up and connect.
Well, it's called St. Clair, which is my middle name, David James St. Clair Lowe. So I don't know how it came about, but that's St. Clair Studios was the name of the studios. But it was a great time. Listen, never made any money from it at all, but I had a great time.
Was this
Don't regret. No, it wasn't that. No. That was before. I mean, again, there's good friends in that as well.
Got the pictures in the back.
There's Ken and Dave and Ray from the Bluebells. Bobby Bluebell's there as well. James King from the Lone Wolves. A Celtic guy that nobody really remembers was Kenny Hislop.
Right.
Kenny Hislop, if you're old enough, was in bands in the 70s called Salvation, which morphed into Slick. And it was early 70s, Bay City Rollers type stuff, pretty cheesy. And Midge was the singer. All right, he's a Rangers guy, forgot about that, yeah. He said, is he? Oh. But Kenny Hislop was a sort of casual Celtic guy, wasn't mad for it. He was involved in the production of that. And one of the tracks on that record you've got there, the Wally Malloy Experience, is It Had to Be Celtic, which Kenny basically produced. And it's still, for me, the best Celtic song ever. It's all on Spotify. You should listen to it if you've got a chance. But Kenny Hislop was behind that great Celtic song.
We're going to share the link to Spotify because Ken, when he was in, gave us that link, David.
Yeah.
And I've been listening to that because he told us the background to some of the songs, and I loved it.
Yeah.
Phenomenal that we've now got the record in the Acsom collection as well.
Yeah. You can do a wee prize because I've got like a couple hundred of them.
Oh, brilliant. We'll do that. We'll definitely do it. We love giveaways, David.
Yeah.
Now, you're fresh from being down in Birmingham, and we will talk about Celtic in Europe. Every time you and I have met and spoken about Celtic, the European question and discussion takes place. So here's my take on it. We've always talked about European progression. What does it look like? Brendan Rodgers comes in and I think to myself, that's a good move, bringing him back. Then we have that transfer window and I'm thinking nothing's changed. That's not a great transfer window. But then since then, it looks as though we do have an intent here to start buying players that we can put right into a starting 11 in the Champions League, David. And I know we were a wee bit short against Aston Villa, but I think in terms of the guys we've been buying in over the last couple of windows and moving into January, shows as though we do have a bit of ambition. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, I think there's been a shift in the dynamic at Celtic and at the macro level. Celtic will always be trying to run up a down escalator in Europe because they're hampered by this lack of media money. They can beat just about everybody or match just about everybody in terms of all other revenue streams, match day sponsorship, a whole lot. But you're missing the media money. So, and they will always miss it, and they will always play second or third fiddle, and they will always find it difficult to progress, as any other big team in a small league will do. And the holy grail for Celtic's always been to plug into the English market or the European market, if needs be at the expense of the domestic market, so that we can compete in a level playing field. And Celtic have tried just about everything on and off over the years to try and achieve that. You know, we had the Atlantic League very many years ago. You know, when I was around, we had sort of clever plans which almost came off, but you know, the rules were moved, the rules changed, and it didn't happen. And maybe you'll ask me about that later. But I think there is winds of change. The media money has peaked. Younger people are not really interested in going to a centralised location and watching a game every other week with 100 other people. There's much more of this watching it on your phone or watching it on your device, on your own or with friends, or uploading it to a big screen. Or, you know, there's other ways of consuming sports product. And I think that's, we're seeing early stage rethinking of the whole model in terms of leagues, super leagues, big brands, jurisdictions. I think it's all up for grabs. And maybe Celtic sort of smell that a little bit and are speculating a little bit with the cash balance that they have. So I think there's grounds for optimism because Brendan is getting money he didn't get last time round.
Yep.
That's why he left, as far as I'm concerned. And some of the money getting spent's been very impressive. Still a wee bit short in a few positions. But I think there was only 2 players in it in that game against Villa. I think if we had a full team out and maybe a couple of other new players in, we could have gone toe-to-toe and could have won that game. They were just a little bit lacking in key positions. Very optimistic. I mean, I come back from that game feeling not too bad at all.
You know, when you're mentioning that there, people scoff at Scottish football all the time, David. But I tend to agree, if we had the full-strength team out and it was post-January and you've got Jota and potentially Kieran Tierney, I agree with you. I think you're strong enough then. You might come away with a 3-2 defeat. That can happen away from home against a strong team. But I agree with you, and I think we're on the right path. The one thing that I always go back to when we're talking about Celtic and playing in a different, what would then be their domestic league, is I sometimes look at the other teams and think, you know what, you are underachieving. The game, I last spoke to you at the Aberdeen game, 6-0 game.
Yeah.
And up till that point, Aberdeen were doing all right. I mean, I was looking at them thinking, right, you've bought well, you've got a manager in, you're you know, actually mounting some kind of a challenge for second place.
Yeah.
But Aberdeen, Hibs and Hearts specifically, and also Dundee United, should always do better in my view. I remember you spoke a few years back about the potential of a club like Hibs.
Yeah.
So do you think these guys need to bring more to the party as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think all these secondary clubs that you just mentioned there are perennial underperformers. I don't know why. I mean, if you look at all the financial numbers, you know, Hearts are the number 3 club. Aberdeen and Hibs sort of vie for the next positions, and the rest are sort of just making up the numbers. I think they have underperformed, but it's all about money. It's not through lack of spending. Hibs have continual overspent because the owner is or was rich. Hearts are the same. Hearts almost went bust Rangers style. So and Rangers, of course, did go bust, and that leaves Aberdeen. There's lots of people losing lots of money in these clubs. Eddie Thompson, the dead now, he basically lost his fortune in Dundee. So there's lots of people put lots of money into all the wannabe clubs without any apparent return. You know, they didn't do well on the park when they lost the money off the park, and the clubs were sold for knockdown prices, and the Rangers instance was liquidated. So the game is very unbalanced here and very uncompetitive. In my lifetime, and I'm in the 60s now, only 6 teams have won it. I bet you can't remember them all. When I was a kid, before I was at school, it was Kilmarnock and Dundee had won it.
Right.
Then you get the new firm, Aberdeen and Dundee United, then the Celtic and Rangers. But I'm in my 60s. If you're in your 40s, if you're 40, say, go back 40 years, is it Celtic and Rangers only that's won the league? So it's not, you know, it's not that exciting, is it? For many people.
No, you're right.
For the diehards, it'll always be exciting. But for the casual, am I going to the game? Am I not going to the game? Am I spending £700 on a season ticket, or am I not? You know, it's stale, and you've always got to try and keep it exciting. So Fergus McCann said in 1993, money doesn't guarantee success, but no money guarantees no success.
Yeah.
We've got all the money and we're successful domestically. Rangers have no money, and that's really essentially, or they've wasted a lot of money while they're not successful, but we've always have more money than everybody else. So the chances are we will always dominate the local or the domestic football scene. But for somebody my age, we always gauge Celtic's success and what it does in Europe.
Yeah.
Because I grew up with the Halcyon days. I started watching Celtic basically the year Jock Stein arrived. And I was married man with kids before I realised we weren't winning it again, you know, because the game had moved on. But that's what I grew up with. That's what I'm used to. And getting humped in Europe, I find particularly debilitating and depressing. And I would do anything to try and get us back to where we belong, and that is back with the big clubs playing in quarterfinals, semi-finals and finals. but it won't happen. I think that takes us back to the original point, till there's a realignment, I think, of the jurisdictions and the broadcasting revenues, which make clubs wealthy or not wealthy. But I see early signs of that, and maybe Celtic do as well, and that's why they're back in Brendan.
When I look at that, and the tried and tested argument that we always get is, it's a farmers' league. Celtic wouldn't survive down here, they'd be in the Championship, which is a nonsense argument, David, because we wouldn't be operating as we currently are within Scottish football. And my counter is always that if an English club came to Scotland under the same terms, it would go bust, because it wouldn't be able to finance the wages, etc. But if we do look at something you mentioned, and it was pre-98, and we spoke about it the very first time we were on a Celtic State of Mind, and the amount of people I now speak about this subject to who haven't heard the story is astonishing. And this was when you were looking for some kind of way to get Celtic basically into English football.
Yeah.
So take us back, was this 97, 98?
It would be then.
Yeah.
Fergus was in, so we succeeded in changing the board, getting all the money in, and we're on a positive upwards trajectory domestically. Next challenge is, how do we get onto a larger stage? As far as I'm concerned, I think him as well, and others on the board, not all others. So, because we were shit in Europe, that's what I'm saying. I judge Celtic in European terms, not domestic terms, and getting humiliated in Europe was very depressing. So I'm an investment analyst to trade. That's how we did the Celtic deal. So I looked at all the rules and regulations and engaged senior counsel in Edinburgh to go through the football rules, both domestically and at the international football board level. That's basically all the British leagues plus Ireland, as well as UEFA, and discovered that there was no rule anywhere that stopped a Scottish club domiciled in Scotland, we'll talk about Glasgow, playing in an English league. No rule anywhere. I said, okay, that's very interesting. So what does that mean? It means if we bought an English club, changed its name in the English system, doesn't matter whether it was whether it was in the Premier League or whether it was in the old third division, it was called, second division now, moved its registered ground from wherever to Glasgow, changed its name from whatever to Celtic, and changed its colours from whatever to the hoops, we would have Celtic playing in the English league system.
Yeah.
Then everybody goes, well, what about, and you still get Celtic Park and you've developed it, so that's a neutral, but what about the Scottish game? Well, you can still field a team in the Scottish game. It could be a second team, it could be the reserve team, it could be a youth team. In this day and age, it could be, guess what, a ladies team, because we're talking about doing this exactly now.
Yeah.
Scottish team plays in Scotland, but ladies team plays in British League. So controversial at the time, less so now. Anyway, there's no rules to do that. And being the type of fellow I am, I'm gung-ho, let's do this, let's buy an English club, Fergus, I don't know, have to think about it. So it just so happened at the same time, Sam Haman and his brother had Wimbledon. The Wimbledon had been a nothing team, weren't even in the big leagues. I think they were in the conference, it was called at the time. But they come up through the leagues. We've actually done 3, 2, 1.
Was it Dave Bassett who was the manager?
He was one of them. Yeah. But I mean, the crazy guy. I mean, they come right through the leagues. Dennis Wise and Vinnie Jones and
Laurie Sanchez and all that.
All of them. I mean, they were mental. Anyway, they get all the way up. But they're playing at a Plough Lane, which is a relatively small stadium in Wimbledon, but not really fit for what is now called Premier League football. The stadium, because at the same time as they're doing this journey, this is just background, by the way, to how it connects with Celtic. Maggie Thatcher's bringing in the Taylor report because there's been a fire at Bradford and lots of people have died. Liverpool fans are getting involved in the Heysel, and English teams are out of Europe in the 60s, and football stadia through lack of capex. And there's another interesting thing that's going on just now, stadia criteria. But anyway, Margaret Thatcher puts this Taylor report recommendation through that all football clubs have to be all seated by, I think it was 1994. I think it was. And Wimbledon couldn't do this. And they started to slip down, and they were in the championship. And the brother said, we want to sell it, and we want 40 million for it. And we don't care who buys it. I mean, I'm simplifying, and that's the gist of it. And they were touting it around everywhere. But when you come into what I just said, you can, for 40 million, you can buy a team in the championship. Mm-hmm. You can change its colours from Wimbledon to green and white. You can change its ground from nowhere, because they don't have a ground, to Celtic Park, and its name. And hey, you're in the championship. And this was before money was crazy. You know, the gap between the Scottish League and the English League wasn't as big as it is now. But you know, that could be done. Now, there's a controversial element to it, you know, what happens to all the poor Wimbledon fans. And indeed, this was a sort of talk of the steamy when Wimbledon actually ended up going to become an MK Dons, Milton Keynes Dons. Yeah. And what happens is, you know, the Wimbledon fans form a new Wimbledon team. And I don't know where they're playing. It could be Plough Lane. But they might be back in the English League system. I think they are, in fact. So that would have got Celtic in the 1990s into the championship, and we wouldn't be having this discussion at all. And, you know, the Celtic board at the time seriously considered it, had a name for it. It was Project Strawberry. Don't know why. Considered it and didn't do it. And this is an example of it wasn't just the Fergus McCann show. Yeah. It was a democratic board that came to a democratic decision not to do it. But I was right up for it. And indeed, myself and a couple of friends bought Clydebank. Now, I'm calling it a stalking horse to prove that it could be done, rather than a concerted plan hand in glove with Celtic, which it categorically wasn't. But again, Clydebank were in a similar situation whereby the Steedmans who owned the club had sold Kilbowie, and it became a Tesco. And they were this sort of nomadic club that were playing in, I think they played in Dumbarton, and they played across the river at somewhere else, you know, and they had hardly any fans. And they were a very new club because they had sort of sneaked in to the league, but they sneaked into the league when by buying East Stirlingshire, which was a tiny club. I call it Falkirk. Is it Falkirk? It's your neck of the woods, isn't it? No,
it's in that ballpark, yeah.
And that got them into the league in the early 60s, and then East Stirlingshire fans objected and all that. The league threw them back out. Thurlarnut went bust, and that allowed Clydebank to come in. So they sort of were born in nefarious or harsh, and sort of, you know, were going to die in sort of similarly harsh situations, and they were a small club. So we basically, the stalking horse thing, this is me and the other guys, let's move it to Dublin. Are you fucking crazy? You know, why? There's no rule that says you can't. This is a fact. So Dublin's the fourth largest city in the British Isles. It's twice the size of Glasgow. Doesn't have a league to play in because the Irish league was pretty shit then. And suddenly you doubled the size of the Scottish market. You've got Scotland with its population of whatever it is, 5.5 million. You've got Ireland, talking about the island, with similar. So you basically doubled the size of your market. You've doubled everything. Sponsorships, television revenue. It's actually brilliant for the Scottish game to have a team in Dublin with that potential, with all those people twice the size of Glasgow, playing in the Scottish game. It'd be fantastic for the Scottish game. You can't argue against it. So and it's a precedent, and there's no rule to stop it. And I mean that, no rule to stop it at that time. So big press conference, Clydebank moving to Dublin. Hired the ground and everything. Royal Dublin Society in Ballsbridge. Ground hired. Ian McCall was the manager, a friend of mine, the ex-Rangers guy. Clydebank at the time. He went over to Dublin and had a press conference. And it's all happening. So the SFA are dead against it. Who was the SFA guy? It was in charge at the time. It might have been Farry. And then there was an Irish guy called Ollie Byrne. He ran that. So the last thing he wanted, the guy in charge of the Irish League, last thing he wanted was the biggest club in the island, Dublin City, playing in somebody else's league.
Yeah.
So he's against it. For some reason, the SFA are against it. And the SFL it was, against it, even though it would be great because doubles the size of the market. So they get together and go, you know what? There's no rule against this. They can do this. What are we going to do? So you got to remember, this is 1997, 98. And it's looking good. So what actually happened? That was a year of the World Cup in France. The authorities in UEFA don't want it to happen because it sets a precedent. So Ajax can join the Bundesliga if this happens. Porto can join La Liga. Where does it end? And all the structures that we're familiar with all come to an end. So I get that. Anyway, what do? They change the rules. Change the rules to prevent any club domiciled in a jurisdiction with a football league can't play in somebody else's league unless it's with a football league, unless it's in what's called a trans-border geographic region not separated by a mountain range.
Right.
So and everyone, what about Derry? And what about Monaco? And what about the Welsh clubs? And there's reasons for all of that. Derry's there because of the Troubles. Monaco's there because, it's half a rock. It's no league to play in. And there are other anomalies as well. So that rule was passed. It's called at the plenary, basically stopping it from happening because they were so scared of it. The precedent that it set. Had it gone through, it clears the way for Celtic to buy Wimbledon or anybody else. This is before the money was crazy, and that would have been the cheapest 40 million quid that Celtic have ever spent.
Yeah.
If you think about it,
the timing of that, David.
Yeah.
When you think about that,
But that is an unspoken chapter in the Celtic story, which you will read in my book at some point.
Operation Strawberry.
Operation Strawberry, yeah.
You mentioned there the women's team are in discussions
about
playing in some type of a British league. In your view, when you look at the new setup of the Champions League, and it's been very exciting this year, and I agree with you, we're a bit short, but if the broadcasting thing kind of streamlines, or flatlines rather, and Celtic can get more of a share and start competing on a regular basis, David, does that remove the need, do you think? Or do you still need to have that competitive edge at home?
I think it's my view has always been it's very, very difficult to step up. If you're sparring, I think I've got a boxing analogy. If you're sparring against people that are not as heavy and you're talented and you're winning all the time, that's a disadvantage when you step up again and play against financial heavyweights. You can step up, but it's difficult to keep it up for 15 rounds or 90 minutes, to use the football correlation. So I think we start every game at a disadvantage. And I think Aston Villa sums that up perfectly. We were there, but not there enough. We just fell a little bit short. And I think we'll always fall a little bit short, more often than not, unless we are able to compete against teams like Aston Villa on a level playing field. So we suffer from this the same way that the clubs domestically suffer against us. We're always going to beat them except on domestically, except on exceptional occasions. The same applies to us in the European stage. But I keep saying, if you judge Celtic at the European stage like somebody of my age does, we're at a disadvantage. That's why somebody like me and lots of other people are really motivated to try and cut this Gordian knot, which is a Herculean task, one of them.
Yeah.
So,
when I look at last year, David, you and I actually done a fantastic live event with Kevin McCann, a good friend of yours, in Greenock, and that was to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the takeover. And then last year, I watched with interest Tino and the Celtic Exchange doing a brilliant series of interviews with people like yourself, Brian Dempsey, and others. And we're now at this stage where we're 31 years almost down the line from the takeover. What do you think the legacy is of Fergus? Is the legacy this incredible success that, I mean, let's be honest, no one's had this domination of the Scottish game ever that we've had over the, let's say since the turn of the century. Is this the legacy of Fergus?
Totally. But we're now looking to the next legacy. So was Fergus, was the board, me, anybody else, so clever that we saw this total domination coming? No. But I'll tell you what, building that 60,000 seater stadium, which everybody was saying, what do you want that for? Our average crowds are 35, you'll never fill it. But his attitude was, I'm building them, they'll come. So that platform, and remember when he was there, and remember all the shit that he used to take. I mean, it was pretty heavy. Because everybody wants immediate success. You can't if you're building a platform, you can't have it's difficult to have immediate success from that platform. It takes time. But ever since that stadium was bought and paid for, which was the early noughties, and all the cash flow that the football club generated could then essentially be ploughed into the team rather than X% having to pay off the costs associated with building the stadium. Ever since we basically became cash free, that's coincided with the opposite happening to Rangers. So we've basically got stronger and stronger and stronger, and they've got weaker and weaker and weaker. And their nemesis was the financial crash in 2008, talking about Rangers now, where basically the bank says no more. You've got to downsize. So they were downsizing for 4 years before the shit hit the fan, 2012. And they've never recovered. They had a great chance when they formed a new club, when they raised £20 million in the city. And if they were smart, they would have used that smartly and basically managed their cash flow and go up through the leagues with a decent budget. But they squandered all of that, and they've lost another 100 million, and they're in a terrible state. It's not a good. It must be really depressing for Rangers fans. There's only a certain amount of pleasure you can take for it, because I also believe you need a strong Rangers as part of that competition that gives you the edge when you step up into Europe. I don't think it's healthy, to have a weak Rangers or a weak anybody else for that matter. I think you've got to have strong domestic opposition. And that was behind all the dodgy deals that were done when they were recreated in the five-way agreement. The Celtic directors and the football authorities took this pragmatic view that you need a strong Rangers at the top as soon as possible. And they bent and broke rules to do it. They really did. But, what can you say?
When you look at that, because from a fan's perspective, and I totally understand why fans want to know the truth about the five-way agreement. From a business perspective, the club have remained kind of stum on it. I think that will always be the case, that we'll never really know the full truth of it.
I think things will come out in due course, long after the event. It's like the releasing the JFK diaries. Everybody will be dating, nobody will care. And at the end of the day, nobody cares about anything as long as you're winning trophies. Nobody cares who owns Celtic until it matters. Because all you want to do is win the game on Saturday, win leagues, win trophies. And everything else is just secondary and tertiary. But at the end of the day, we're getting stronger and stronger. And to go back to your final point, never in the history of both brands, I'll call it, or of the three clubs, we'll call it, has Celtic dominated to such an extent, and I don't see that changing.
No. And it does look, like we said at the top of the discussion, it does look as though we are showing that ambition, David. But there was two things you mentioned there. The first one was the stadium. For about a year, we were going every Monday and doing a wander around Paradise, and I spoke quite a bit, without trying to criticise the football club, about how tired the stadium was looking.
Yep.
And that then takes into not just the fact that the redevelopment's now 30 years down the line, but also the surrounding areas looking a wee bit like a concrete graveyard. And then you've got the main stand question, because you know, there was always that thought process. First season ticket I ever had was after Fergus took over, because he advertised it. It seemed unattainable before then, David, you know, and the figures would show that not that many people had them until Fergus came in and introduced this idea of normalising the purchase of a season ticket.
I think it was 8,000 season ticket holders when he came in.
Astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you look at it now.
Yeah.
And you look at that main stand, and it is in dire need of an upgrade.
Yeah.
And I've seen loads of different estimates in terms of the cost and how we would do it. I was just looking at the simplistic side of how do you rehouse the season ticket holders from the main stand? Well, there's a drop-off of 1 to 2% every year through death and circumstances. It would probably take about 3 seasons before you could rehouse everybody within the other 3 stands. Do you think the club will do it? Do you think it's financially something that we should do?
Well, I definitely think we've got to do it. Again, to put what you just asked there in context, this very issue comes up every second generation. It's a history of football whereby since football became professional way back in the day, the late 1890s, everybody always wants to put as much money that they generate on the park. The corollary of that is that if you're putting too much money on the park, it means you're putting hardly any money into the fabric, the base, the platform on which you play your football. And again, nobody cares. Year 1, you don't really notice if that doesn't get painted or if that gets patched. Year 2, but it has this it's like a house, it has a cumulative effect. If you don't do it up every, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, eventually, you know, you'll have to do it at a big winner. So the history, the Grant stand was built on that basis, whereby, I think it was the 20s or something, whereby it was Celtic Park was a bit of a shithole. You know, then they need some money, so you bring somebody in, he ends up with a percentage of the club, and then his money builds it, and you have the Grant stand. Every club's got a story like that. And indeed, if you go right up to now, that's where Celtic were in the 80s. Nobody had put any money really into this at all other than patch it up. My father and all his friends would, think about it now, kids don't realise this, you would stand in the pissing rain with no cover, no seat, guys peeing into cans, with damp fags, and if you were in the jungle, there was piss dripping in your head, because it was just breeze blocks.
Better than bottles, is it? I'm not sure.
It was just terrible. So right up to the 60s, people would put up with this. But, living standards in the 60s, you never had it so good, I mentioned earlier. More and more people were saying, screw this, there's plenty of other ways of spending my time.
Yeah.
So all of that event in Celtic would patch it up. They put a cover in the Rangers end and half a cover in the Celtic end. And in 1970, they built that stand. In the 60s, you had to get there an hour before kickoff, and wait in a big queue and get a shit seat at the edge if you wanted to sit in the stand. 1970, they built the new stand, and I think it opened with Penarol or something, some Uruguayan team or something. And then in 1988, they built this bit in the front, borrowed £2 million, I think it was. First time Celtic had ever borrowed money to build the bit in the front. And but it's all piecemeal, and it got so bad that when Fergus came in, the Taylor report was kicking in. We had a serious problem. We had no seats.
Yeah.
Apart from the 8,000 in the main stand, I think it was. And I think the idea was just to bench it all.
Right.
Just stick benches on it so that they could stay in power. The point is, lack of investment. It has to get addressed eventually. And there was no payback for not investing, because unless there's a disaster or there's a law introduced that compels you to do it, you're not going to do it. So, Rangers had a disaster in 1970, 66 people died, I think it was. And that was a spark, for them to start rebuilding. And I think they were all seated more or less by the 1980s. I can't remember because I only went there twice a season. But we'd get nothing. So we had to raise all that money, and we did what we did. But to get to the here and now, to answer your question now, Celtic, redeveloped Celtic Park 1994 is already out of date. It's already old.
Yeah.
It can be classified as an old stadium. The main stand, which was built in 1970, is dead old.
Yeah.
And is not, for my money, me and my mates got a box there. It's not fit for purpose. When I go to Hampden and look at the facilities there, they're banging. Everton, well, not Everton, Tottenham, sorry. Everton, I'm going to work.
Tottenham's sensational, David.
It's like a shopping mall, though. I think I've gone too far. And, it's too antiseptic. It's not got the atmosphere. But all around Europe, Camp Nou, Bernabeu, we're going to see Bayern Munich now. Is it next month? This is the new theme in town. Stadium redevelopment. We've got to improve the facilities again. And I think the Celtic board is smart enough. I'm going to try and answer the question now. I think the Celtic board is smart enough to know that part of the cash flow has to be allocated to improving that main stand, because it's not fit for purpose. It looks like a 1980s stadium. It's got dado rails and bulky furniture and cranky air conditioning, and if you're going to buy a box, it might as well be a good box, So no, I think this is a new theme in town, and there's a way around it. If it takes 3 years, you just pay somebody to not sit for 3 years. You're going to come out the other end stronger and better.
Yeah.
And they can afford it. 100% can afford it. They get money in the bank. There's not been a Celtic share issue for 20 years. So there's an unsatisfied demand to increase the equity base.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole young new generation that would buy shares in Celtic, want to own part of Celtic. That market's not being tapped at all. Never mind any gearing that you want to introduce. So it's definitely affordable. And I think it's needed, because I don't think it was fit for purpose, the main stand.
Was there a reason at the time, David, do you think, that the entirety of the stadium wasn't redeveloped to that kind of same standard back in '94?
Well, I think it was bold to go from, take average crowds of 35,000 and build a 60,000 seater stadium. Nobody believed it would be full. And indeed, lots of people say, it's crap, it'll never work out, you'll never pay for it, But McCann, tapped into, he was the right man at the right place, and he tapped into this whole pent-up frustration that Celtic fans had about the management of their club. And I think there's a pent-up demand again to invest in the club again, and they could definitely afford it if they wanted to do it. But, you're always the temptation to put as much money as you can on the park. What would you rather have? A redeveloped stand that costs 100 million? Or would you put 100 million into the team? That's the balancing act that had to be carried out in the 90s. That would have to be carried out again this time round.
You spoke about, the stick that Fergus took. Around about that time, we were demanding that the money was on the park.
Give him the money.
Give him the money. Give Decanio the money. And
give him it all.
Absolutely. All these years later, there seems to be that appreciation now of Fergus McCann. It wasn't always like that. There's probably a whole generation of Celtic fans who think he's always been a hero. But even after the takeover and everything else, and we win to stop the 10 in a row, he's booed at Celtic Park. But his legacy has completely changed now, David.
Yeah, because we're getting the dividend.
Yeah.
We're getting the dividend. We're getting the return from the platform, the investment, if you want to look at it that way. Whilst that platform is getting built and Rangers are going 7, 8, 9 in a row, you don't care about anything else. All you want, and there's somebody at the media and people stoking the media to have a go at Fergus and the board. People believe what they read in the papers.
Yeah.
Believe what they're told. The kid, they don't think they do, but they do. So he get toasted. He actually said to me once, if I knew how hard this was going to be, I don't know if I would have done it.
Right.
It was vicious, and he wasn't appreciated. But he is now, because look at us. We're kings of the castle now.
I know. I remember speaking to you before, David, and you said there was a moment where I think he was standing, or you and Fergus were standing in what might have been Terry Cassidy's old office, and you were looking out and there was a queue of people who were queuing up to buy shares. And there was a moment of realisation at that time that Fergus was like, wow, this is the magnitude of what we've done here.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
So it was Terry Cassidy's office, which is now part of the Waldorf restaurant. It's that sort of glass at an angle. And looking out, it's a big queue, round the block, down the car park, all holding a bit of paper, to buy shares in a football club. And he's saying, that was the moment I realised the size of the responsibility that I've taken on here, and I just cannot let these people down. So that's exactly what he said.
What do you think? You got to know him really closely, David. What do you think now, as his kind of frame of mind, looking back on it? Does he realise how appreciated he is now?
I think he does. Well, I know he does. But I don't think he thinks any more than that. I think he's a 100% big Celtic fan. He knows he's adored. But beyond that, I don't think it matters much at all. He's not that type of guy to overanalyze it.
Right.
See, for a lot of young people though, because I've got nephews and nieces now, and they talk about Fergus McCann, that I would talk about Jimmy McGrory, some guy I'd never seen. This guy, my nephew's kid is like 12. He's only ever known, he's 12, so he's Celtic won 11 out of 12 or something. He thinks this is the norm. He's never heard of Fergus McCann. I mean, all these guys that are letting off flares, tell me more about this guy McCann. He's like Jimmy McGrory or Johnny Thompson. He's like some guy.
Mythical
Kaiser Soze type that existed back in the day. You tend to forget that. If you were around at the time, you're familiar with it. But he's been away, it's like 20 odd years now, 30 years, 1999. It's 25 years. It's a long, long time.
If we bring it right back up to the modern times, one of our discussions previously, David, was about these untraced shares that are kind of languishing.
Yeah.
Is that still an issue? A couple of years
Well, I think it is. So my position here is that nobody gives a shit about Celtic, who owns Celtic, until you have to. Right? That's because we're winning everything and life is great until something happens. So I don't think that's a healthy thing. So Celtic's got a huge amount of shareholders, but most of these shares, just about all of them, were bought in 1994. That's 40 years ago, right? And for a lot of those people, it's the only share they will ever have bought. And they bought it at a time in the world whereby it was a bit of paper, a cheque. And nephews don't know what a cheque is, by the way. Tell me more about this cheque thing. And with a staple, and you take it, you hand it in, and then you get a scroll, nice scroll at the time, in a tube. With watercoloured Celtic squad from 1888 or something. And it goes in a drawer, or if some occasion it goes in a frame in the wall. And it's the only thing they've ever bought. Then when the owner dies, or when they move house, nobody actually knows, and why should they? You're supposed to tell somebody, that my mum's died, in their mind now, and there's a bit of paper from the lawyer that says so, going to put them in my name at my address. And again, when you flip, you don't tell. So if you stay there and you move there and you don't tell the club or the club's registrars, which is the organisation that updates the share register, what happens is it has this cumulative effect. All companies have this, but football companies in particular have it a lot worse. There's always about 4 or 5% of any public company's shares are what you could call untraced for those reasons. The football clubs, it's a lot more. It's anywhere between 10 and 20%. So because the share issue is so long ago now, people are dead. People have moved several times. And the number of missing shares is like 20%.
Right.
I've calculated, a few years ago. So what that means is if somebody like Dermot, who has 40, how much has Dermot got? Well, he's got like 40%. That's 40% of 100%. But if 20% is missing or dead or untraced, 40% of 80% is 50%. And each year it gets worse because each year more people die, more people move. And guess what? This is exactly how the Whites and the Kellys were able to maintain control of Celtic from a minority position because so many other people's houses were knocked down, tenements knocked down, and the club lost trace of who owned the shares. History is repeating itself, and it will only get worse. So who cares? Well, you don't care until you have to care.
Yeah.
So another wee bit I'll mention is that everybody always says, I'll never sell those shares. Never. How much? So they were bought at 60. They went up to 60 pence, they went up to a fiver. Those share certificates were coming off the wall at a 10 a penny. People were, how do you sell a share?
Yeah.
Everything that walks is a price. Everything's for sale at the right price. That's just the way of the world. And the ownership profile at the Celtic is out of balance. When we did the Fergus share sale in 1999, there was a pretty equitable balance between the business interests, which was Dermot and a couple of other people, and the fans. It was roughly 50-50. But since then, there was two other share issues, one in 2001 and one in 2005. And Celtic fans were exhausted with share issues. That generation, I mean.
Yeah.
They'd put so much of the base, had put so much into the first issue in 95 that there was diminishing interest in 1991, 1999, 2001 and 2005. So that allowed the corporate interest in Dermot in particular to emerge with a far higher percentage than was ever envisaged, because balance is a good thing. It swam into balance. That balance has been lost, and that imbalance gets worse with these deaths because untraced goes up. So those that are connected get more and more of an ownership profile at the expense of the untraced, and it's only going one way, and it'll be a worry, but it doesn't matter until it has to matter. So I'll tell you what, if there was a takeover of Celtic offer of £5 a share from some private equity firm or whoever, everybody would be scrambling about for their untraced shares.
Without a doubt. And
that's just the way of the world,
When I look at the fans who've got shares, they're emotionally attached to them. They're not buying them for the business aspect until such times as they might be able to make a few quid. But my biggest fear, and I know you've spoken previously about being in a situation where you're vulnerable to a rogue takeover, David, is that people run the football club who have no emotional attachment to Celtic. Yeah. And at the moment, we're not in that position because, as you say, Dermot Desmond's a Celtic fan. There has been comments made fairly recently whereby we're not selling up, but as you say, everything's got its price. Are we still in that precarious situation? Because there's texts and WhatsApps going about the now saying that, I've heard that something's in the offing.
Well, I don't know if something's in the offing, and so I'm not going to speculate. I try and deal with the fact. I think we are in the situation. You said we're not in the situation. I think we are in the situation just now. So, Dermot is a Celtic fan, but everybody keeps going on about this guy, Nick Train. Nick Train has no emotional investment in Celtic at all. I'll go even further. Nick Train doesn't actually own any shares in Celtic at all. That's one of the great misunderstandings. Celtic's second largest shareholder are a couple of funds that are managed by Nick Train's company. What does that mean? It means that there's an investment trust called Finsbury. This is off the top of the head, so I don't want any anorak correcting me if I don't get it exactly right. Finsbury Growth and Income Trust or Fund. It's a limited company, it's an investment trust, and it's worth £1.4 billion last time I looked. And it's got 25 investments in it. So this is a £1.5 billion fund, 25 investments. Its smallest investment by a mile is a holding in Celtic. So it's Celtic's second largest shareholder, and it's an unemotional shareholder. It doesn't care about Celtic winning anything. It just is interested in the share price. And it's the smallest investment in this fund. And it doesn't really matter whether Celtic shares are £2, £3, £5. Such is the small nature of the investment in this fund that it's not going to shift the dial in terms of the fund's share price. So you go, well, what's it there for? So that's a mystery. Why on earth is this guy, Nick Train, bought shares in Celtic in this fund when it's not going to affect the value of the fund because it has such an insignificant proportion of the fund? It makes no difference whether it goes to 50 pence or £2. So that's a mystery and that's a worry because it's an unemotional investor. And if a private equity or a sheikh or an Arab or any third party comes along and says, hey, Nick, I'll give you £2.50 for your shares, what you should do or would do is take the money. So suddenly you've got another owning a large chunk of Celtic, and you'd have to think why. So that is one of the reasons I worry. There's another smaller holding in another fund that he's got, a Lindsay Train UK Growth Fund or whatever. That's an even bigger fund. That's like a £2.5 billion fund with an even smaller investment in Celtic. So bearing in mind, these funds exist to make money for the people that own them. And the way that the people make money is when the shares in those funds go up in value, because that means the price of the fund goes up in value. But Celtic's tiny investments in these funds, and it's not going to make any difference at all. So it makes no sense as to why it's there. You have to wonder why it's there.
Yeah.
So so we are in this between the untraced 20% and the Lindsay Train 20%. Remember, that's 20% of 100%.
Yeah.
20% of 80%. That's a quarter. So that's like almost half. Is that right? Anyway, it's a big percentage with no interest in Celtic's performance, no direct interest in whether Celtic win games or not. So that's strange. So Celtic are an attractive investment for somebody. I couldn't see somebody like Dermot Desmond, for example, selling shares at anything other than a huge price, if at all, because he said he'll never sell them. So fair enough. You know, I've got Celtic shares. I'll never sell them. How much? I mean, I told you this. I'm not going to tell it again about the old Irish farmer. Yeah. You know, I won't do it again. But everybody's got a price.
Absolutely. Absolutely, David. I mean, it's been fascinating. It always is. And hopefully we can do this again.
Yeah.
Which I think will be your 7th or your 8th appearance on a Celtic State of Mind. But there's always loads to catch up on. Thank you for the record. We'll do a wee competition. And thanks for joining us once again on a Celtic State of Mind.
See you again sometime.
Thanks for joining us once again on a Celtic State of Mind. Join us again next Friday at 6 o'clock for This is Acsom.